Hey, how you getting on? Today on John Brown's hairdryer review channel, I try to find out if the PRS MT15 is as good as everybody says it is. The PRS MT15 came out a couple of years ago. I can't remember when, it's not that long ago, and it was all the rage. People were talking about this amp non-stop, and all the Facebook groups and forums. People seemed to love this amp. There were a few minor complaints such as a noisy effects loop, but other than that, people loved these. These were the talk of the town, so to speak. I didn't get one. I don't know why. But now this year, PRS have launched a Mark II version of this amplifier, and it's a good bit more expensive, but still used prices for the Mark I version have dropped. I see these as cheap as 350 euros here, so that's too cheap to say no to. I got this one in a package deal from my good buddy Luke with a Victory Crack, and I just couldn't say no to the price he offered me for both. And here we are. And what I'm going to do in this video is do my usual stuff. I'm going to play some riffs through this amp with different gain settings, just see what kind of tones I can coax out of this amp, twist some knobs, and then afterwards I'm going to shoot it out against some of the amps behind me right here to see if it holds its own against amps that are far more expensive than it. I'm also going to take a brief look inside of the amp throughout this video, and I want to start off by taking the lid off this in a sec because there's one narrative about this amp that has bothered the shit out of me since it came out. Hold on a second. So I've got the lid off and you can see two big power tubes here. On paper, the PRS MT15, as the name gives away, is a 15 watt amplifier. In reality, what I heard is it puts out more like 25 to 30 watts. But for the sake of the argument, let's just assume it's a 15 watt amplifier here. And you notice it has either two 6L6 or 5881s in this case in the power section, which is a power tube configuration you'd come to expect and has something like a 50 watt power amp, not a 15 watt power amp. And in the beginning when this came out, I think there was an interview with the designer of the amplifier who said if you put different transformers in this amp, you could easily convert it to a 50 watt amplifier. But what some dudes seem to have understood is if I change the output transformer of this amplifier, I can make this a PRS MT50. But that's not how it works, and that's very irritating to me because the output transformer of your guitar tube amp doesn't throttle energy, it doesn't dissipate energy. It's not like an exhaust system that if you make it more narrow, it kind of reduces power, and if you make it bigger, it lets more power through from the engine. That's not how these work. In theory, the power on both sides of a transformer is the same. Of course, that's assuming 100% efficiency, which isn't really how they work in real life. There's always losses somewhere, at least a bit. But output transformers in guitar amps are usually around 94 to 98% efficient. So unless this is a really weird output transformer design that gets ridiculously hot in use, that doesn't work. If you just put a bigger output transformer in here, all you've done is you've made your PRS MT15 more heavy and more expensive. What you need to do is change the power transformer as well. As I understand it, the way amp manufacturers use these bigger output tubes in smaller amp designs is by reducing the plate voltage. So running these power tubes at voltages outside of the spec so they don't generate as much power. But to my surprise, when I tried this out, the plate voltage wasn't as low as I expected. Let me show you. So when I got this amp, I assumed that the plates on the 6L6 or 5881s would be really low voltage, something like 300 volts or something to get 15 watts out of this. But surprisingly, they're not that low at all, not as low as I thought. What I've done here is I've taken one of the power tubes out and I'm measuring the plate voltage unloaded, which gives me a reading of about, I don't know, can you see that? About 430 volts. Where if you want to be precise, you need to measure that with the tube in. In my experience, when the load of the tube is in there, the plate voltage drops by about 25 to 30 volts. So the PRS MT15 will be running at about 400 volts plate voltage, which is still quite low, but it's not as low as I expected it. Most of the big boy amps behind me here with 6L6 and EL34s run at about 460 to 500 volts on the plates with tubes in, so loaded. So higher than this, but not that much more higher than I expected, which in my mind kind of supports the claim that these put out more than 15 watts, so it's closer to 25, 30 watts maybe. Anyway, that's, I just had to get that off my chest. Sorry, I'm going to put the lid back on and then we're going to get into the demo. Righto, I'm all set up. I'm using my Zilla Fatboy for this video. This is an oversized 2x12 and it's a front loading cab. And I have it loaded with a Creamback M and a Celestion Creamback H, I think in that order. I'm about 90% sure I have the Creamback H mic'd up with the dust cap meets the cone with a Shure SM57 on this neat gravity stand. I'm using my favorite overdrive, the Lichtlam Audio King in yellow. As usual, my PRS C24 and drop C sharp. I think that's it. This is how I like the amp set up. So this amp doesn't take any prisoners. It's a very high gain amp, really tight sounding with a boost in front. When I got this amp though, it sounded like this to me. So a little dark and dull sounding, but this amplifier is equipped with a revolutionary feature called a 3-band EQ. We can set the bass and the middle frequencies, as well as the presence here, to suit our style. I really hope that feature catches on in amp design. Now what I'm trying to say is that this is an amp that you need to dial with your ears and not with your eyes. I've got the treble and the mids pretty high, as well as the presence and the bass dialed back a bit. As you're most likely very well aware of, this is a 2-channel amp. There's this red channel, the lead channel for high gain stuff, and there's a clean channel that has blue LEDs that you can either switch with this little switch on the front here, or with an included foot switch. And the clean channel sounds like this. So it's a really crystal clean channel. There's no edge of breakup. There's no dirt here. No gain knob that you could dial up to get to crunchy tones, but the treble pot is a push-pull pot that has a kind of a boost you can add. And I'm not sure if that adds gain or just volume. Let's dial that down a bit. So for me in the room right now, it's really hard to tell if that treble pull boost really changes anything tonally or if it's just a volume boost. Because the jump in volume really messes with my perception. It's really hard to tell tonal differences if there's a big jump in volume. If there's a tonal difference, it's probably not huge. I'm not sure if there's a gain difference either. Anyway, I don't really want to dwell too much on the clean channel because it's a little bit of a one-trick pony. I don't want to complain because it's a clean channel to my liking. I like those crystal cleans. I don't like those dirty cleans so much. So the variety of tones we're going to get from this video is on the gain channel. So we can get those slightly over edge of breakup tones, but the amp sounds a little anemic that way. I don't think it's happy with that setting. Let's up the gain a bit. So it jumps up in gain fairly quickly. That's kind of heavy crunch. However, it really has great string clarity. There's all the notes ring out. I really like that. The amp is a lot of fun that way. Definitely a high gain amp. It feels comfortable there, and it reacts very strongly to a boost, which I find cool. I like that in amps because it gives you a lot of tonal variety. Let's up the gain even more. I think I've broken the foot switch on my King in Yellow. I dropped it earlier on, and it's not switching so well. Of course, now it works, making me look like an idiot. Anyway, let's move up and gain even more. Yeah, I think we've reached gain levels here where the amp is starting to lose that string clarity that I mentioned before that I like so much. But with the boost engaged, it kind of brings it back a bit. But still, let's up the gain some more. That is stupid amount of gain, and the amp gets very noisy, as you can hear. That's far more gain than I'm comfortable playing with. However, it's still usable gain. It doesn't sludge up, especially with the booster front. It still remains tight. It still works. Let's see if we can get it to sound a little sludgy with some EQ. Really, but that doesn't matter. That's not what the amp is made for. However, I could try to butcher some leads. The amp also has a low power mode. I want to check that out. The amp is significantly more quiet. Is it just me, or does the amp sound a little thinner that way? Yeah, it definitely loses some of that low-end chunk, the thickness a bit. However, I think that's a very usable or useful feature if you're in an apartment and have to play a little more quiet, obviously. Duh. So, what else is there to explore? The EQ. I'm going to loop a riff I recorded with the looper pedal on the floor before me and dial the knobs. I'm going to start with bass, go to middle, treble, and then finish off with presence as is. Let's go. That's a very usable EQ in my opinion. The treble and middle pots are very effective. The bass pod, in the room at least, didn't seem to do an awful lot. It's either on or off. I like it a little lower. The presence knob also kind of seems to act in the top half, at least that's how it seems in the room. All the settings are usable in my opinion, except for maybe the treble and the presence all the way up. That can get a little harsh. Before we move on to the Shootout, I want to find out if the effects loop on this amp really is that terrible. I don't use effects at all really. I just have one reverb pedal from Lichtlam Audio, the MT15. I'm going to put it in the loop to see what it does with the noise floor. I do have to say though, the previous owner before my buddy Luke had this amp, made one slight modification of the amp. He changed the effects loop jacks, the stock jacks, with Neutrik, it's a German company, Neutrik, yeah. Jacks. I'm not really sure what that would do with the noise floor, but I just wanted to mention that for the sake of transparency and completion. Let me get the reverb pedal. Doesn't strike me as being particularly noisy. There's a slight level drop. Other than that, it's fine. Cool. Let's move on to the Shootout. And I'm going to be shooting the MT15 out against the EVH 5153 because I think the MT15 might have taken some of the market share off the EVH 5153. The next amp I want to shoot it out against is the Engel Fireball 100. I chose the Fireball not only because there is a lunchbox version of this amp, but the channel topography is quite similar between the MT15 and the Fireball. Both have two channels, a clean channel and a gain channel. And lastly, I want to shoot the MT15 out against the only other lunchbox amp I have, which is out of frame right now. That is the Victory Kraken VX. I need to set that up on top of the EVH 5150, and I'll meet you back here in a sec for the Shootout. Now, before I nominate myself for the prestigious YouTube Continuity Award, I want to change the order a bit. I want to start the Shootout off by comparing the PRS MT15 with the Engel Fireball 100 because that's the most interesting one to me. I think that's going to be the most interesting comparison in this. Comparison, yes. I'm going to be using my KHE amp switcher up there to switch back and forth between the amps during the comparison. I'll tell you on screen which amp you're hearing. Let's go. Let's check out how the clean channels of those amps compare to each other. So the clean channels on both these amps are pretty close to each other. They both do crystal cleans, the type of cleans I like on the amps. I think I have to give it to the MT15 on the clean channels though, because it has a separate EQ. The Fireball has a shared EQ with the high gain channel, same with the 25 watt version of it. And I've got the EQ set on the Fireball the way I like the high gain channel to sound. When I switch over to the clean channel there, I think it's a bit too bright. So clean channels, I prefer the MT15s. High gain channels, preference really. One thing I noticed is that the Fireball has more low end, there's more rumble going on. I mean, this is a cab kind of designed to sound big. The MT15 doesn't really lack any low end at all, but there's just more authority in the low end of the Fireball. And I suppose that's just the power of more power, because this is a 100 watt amp. It has 4 6L6, while this MT15 15 watt amp on paper only has 2 6L6. So I guess that's probably where that comes from. Let's move on to the next amp, which is going to be the EVH. Again, both have similar gain levels. I think I personally slightly prefer the sound of the EVH in this. It just sounds a little cleaner to me. I just prefer its tone. But again, that's just personal preference. There's no right or wrong, better or worse here. They both deliver the goods. Let's move on to the Kraken. Now those two amps sound surprisingly close to each other. I didn't really expect that because when I played them individually and I got them around the same time, they seemed quite different to me. And yes, interestingly enough, I've dialed the EQs rather similarly as well. Treble and mids up on both. Bass rolled off a bit. Cool. Anyway, let's shut this off and take off the backplate and take a look inside. Okay, let me preface this by saying I'm not an amp tech. I'm an engineer, but an automotive engineer, so more on the mechanic side. So take everything I say about the internals of this amp with a grain of salt. The way I repair amps is, and I do repair my own amps, is I kind of poke around in them and hope I don't get electrocuted, try to use common sense, and yeah, I hope they don't explode when I power them on again. So, what do we have here? To be honest, I was pretty surprised when I saw the inside of this amp because given its price point, I didn't really expect much. Now, as I said, I don't really have the background to judge the build quality perfectly on this thing, but everything is accessible. The resistors are nice and big. They seem very well dimensioned. Everything is labeled. I can get at everything, and if something broke on this amp and I'd have to repair it, I wouldn't get a panic attack because everything is accessible. I don't really have to remove anything to get at things. Capacitors here, fine. One could argue about the excessive use of hot glue, but you see those in more expensive amps as well. The power tube sockets are chassis mounted. That's always nice. Pretty cool. Here we have the bias adjustment. You can see there's kind of 1 ohm resistors here in the test points, and from my understanding what that is a 1 ohm resistor on the grid, and what you measure through the probes here is actually the voltage drop across that 1 ohm resistor. And being a 1 ohm resistor, if you apply Ohm's law, the reading you'll have there in millivolts is your bias current in milliamps. And that's something I forgot to mention in the intro there. Not only is the plate voltage on this low, but they recommend setting the bias to 25 to 30 millivolts, which would be 25 to 30 milliamps. And at 400 volts plate on the plates, that's not just cold, that's freezing. But anyway, it sounds cool. So yeah, I'm not complaining. This is also interesting. This is the high and low power switch. And I just assumed that this would switch the 6L6s from pento to triode mode. So it shut off 2 of the grids and reduce the output power of the tubes. However, it seems that this switch is connected to that 25 watt load resistor that's mounted to the chassis there. So it seems that it doesn't switch the operating mode of the power tubes, but it kind of funnels some of the power to that load resistor, so turns it into heat instead. And I remember the Engel iron ball that I had something similar on the back. The iron ball has kind of an adjustable attenuation at the back, or reduced power mode, where you can switch it down to 5 watt, 1 watt, and completely loaded so that you can use it without a cab. And that just switches different resistors into the circuit. I think that's pretty cool. I didn't expect that. So I think that pretty much concludes my video about the PRS MT15. What do you think of it? Tell me down in the comments. My personal opinion of this amp is, if this amp was out when I was 17, 18, I would have been like a dog with 2 tails. I would have wet myself. I'd be so happy because I've seen this now. I've looked it up again. I saw one the other day as cheap as 320 euros. 320 euros for an amplifier that does fantastic high gain sound, great cleans, can hang with some of the big boys here, and also work at lower volumes at home. That's a dream. That's a fantastic amp. And the build quality seems decent as well. I mean, as I said, I can get at everything. Everything is labeled. Components look decent. What's not to like? Fantastic amplifier. I'd be really interested in checking out a Mark II of this amplifier, see if they even improve this somehow, or if something on the inside changed. So yeah, I'm starting to ramble. The wheels are coming off. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much to my awesome Patreons for supporting me. If you want to support me, you can become a Patreon. That's where I upload IR packs, the speakers I demo. If you don't want to do that, you can use some of my affiliate links down below. If you're buying something at Tollman, Sweetwater, or my friends at TubeAmp Doctor, that helps me out an awful lot. Again, thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye! That was weird. Bye!